April 30th, 1945, Bavaria, Germany. The gates of a forced labor camp swing open under American hands. Soldiers of the 14th Armored Division step through mud and silence into rows of skeletal figures wrapped in rags. Among the liberated stand both Allied prisoners and German civilians pressed into labor. Enemies and victims mixed together by war's chaos. Sergeant John Benton, 23rd Infantry Regiment, moves through the crowd distributing rations. A German woman named Elisabeth Schmitt accepts bread with trembling hands. She worked in this camp's factory, assembling parts for aircraft engines, paid nothing, fed almost nothing. Benton was captured at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, survived 2 years behind wire, then joined the advance through Germany. In broken exchanges over 3 days, amid the collapse of the Third Reich, he makes an improbable promise. They do not yet know that this promise will survive peace as it survived war. February 14th, 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. The 34th Infantry Division faced its first major combat against German forces at Kasserine Pass. American troops, newly arrived in theater, encountered Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps with its battle-hardened veterans and superior Mark IV tanks. The American position collapsed within hours. German armor broke through at multiple points. Units scattered across the desert. Sergeant John Benton, age 24, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, found himself cut off with 11 other men from his company. They attempted to reach Allied lines for 3 days, moving at night, hiding during daylight. On February 17th, a German reconnaissance patrol captured them. The soldiers surrendered without resistance. They were searched, their weapons confiscated, their dog tags checked against identity cards. An officer recorded their names and serial numbers in a notebook. They joined a column of other American prisoners, approximately 400 men captured during the battle. The prisoners marched north to the coast, then boarded ships for Italy. From Italian ports, they traveled by rail to Germany. The journey took 2 weeks. Food consisted of occasional bread and thin soup. Many men developed dysentery. 2 died during transport. Benton arrived at Stalag 2B near Hammerstein, Pomerania, in early March 1943. The camp held approximately 80,000 prisoners from various nations: British, French, Soviet, and American. Conditions varied by nationality. Soviet prisoners received the worst treatment, with mortality rates exceeding 50%. Western Allied prisoners fared better due to International Red Cross oversight and the threat of German prisoners in Allied hands receiving reciprocal treatment. The daily ration for American prisoners consisted of 300 grams of bread, 1 liter of turnip soup, and occasional portions of margarine or ersatz coffee. Red Cross parcels supplemented this when available, providing canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, and coffee. These parcels arrived irregularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes with gaps of months. Benton worked in various labor details. Under the Geneva Convention, sergeants could not be forced to work, but many volunteered to escape the monotony of camp life. He spent time in agricultural work, road repair, and eventually in a factory producing electrical components for military equipment. By 1944, Germany's industrial system depended heavily on forced labor. Approximately 7 million foreign workers and prisoners worked in German industry by mid-1944, representing roughly 20% of the total workforce. POWs formed one category within this system, alongside civilian deportees from occupied territories. Benton's letters home, preserved in family archives and later donated to the State Historical Society of Iowa, document his experience. In a letter dated June 8, 1944, he wrote to his mother, "The work is not terrible. We build small parts whose purpose we do not know. The guards treat us correctly. Food is short, but we manage. Tell Dorothy I think of her often." Dorothy was his fiancée in Iowa. That engagement would not survive the war. The camp population shifted as the front lines moved. In January 1945, with Soviet forces approaching from the east, German authorities evacuated Stalag 2B. Approximately 25,000 prisoners marched west in what became known as the Long March. Benton was among them. The march lasted from late January through early April 1945. Prisoners walked approximately 600 kilometers in brutal winter conditions. They slept in barns, open fields, and occasionally in temporary camps. Food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Guards themselves were starving, often older men or those wounded on the Eastern Front, no longer fit for combat duty. Approximately 3,500 prisoners died during this march, primarily from exposure, starvation, and disease. Those who fell behind were sometimes shot, sometimes left to die, sometimes picked up by following columns. The chaos of Germany's collapse meant discipline and organization deteriorated progressively. By April, the column Benton marched with had fragmented, guards deserted or simply walked away. Some prisoners escaped and hid with German civilians, others continued moving west, hoping to reach American or British lines rather than Soviet forces. On April 27, 1945, Benton's group of approximately 200 prisoners stumbled into American lines near Regensburg, Bavaria. They were liberated by elements of the 14th Armored Division, 3rd Army. Medical personnel examined them. Most suffered from malnutrition, lice, and various infections. Benton had lost approximately 40 pounds from his pre-capture weight of 170 pounds. Rather than immediate repatriation, Benton volunteered to remain with the advancing forces as a translator and liaison. He spoke some German, learned during childhood from his grandmother who had immigrated from Bavaria in 1887. This decision kept him in Germany through the final days of the war and into the early occupation period. April 30th, 1945, Landsberg am Lech, Bavaria. The 14th Armored Division discovered a forced labor camp attached to a satellite facility of Dachau concentration camp. The main Dachau camp lay 30 kilometers to the east and would be liberated by the 45th Infantry Division the same day. The Landsberg camp held approximately 1,500 people. The population mixed German civilians, foreign workers, and a smaller number of concentration camp prisoners transferred for industrial work. The facility produced components for Messerschmitt aircraft engines, assembling and testing magnetos, fuel pumps, and electrical systems. Unlike the main concentration camps, this facility operated under military-industrial administration rather than SS control. Though SS guards maintained security, the workers received minimal payment, often only credits usable in camp canteens that stocked almost nothing. Housing consisted of wooden barracks designed for perhaps 800 people, now holding nearly double that number. When American forces arrived, they found the camp partially evacuated. Guards had fled 2 days earlier. Many prisoners had already left, seeking food in surrounding villages or attempting to return home. Those who remained were primarily those too weak to move, or those who feared leaving without official papers. Sergeant Benton entered the camp with a medical unit on April 30th. His role involved translation and documentation, recording names, nationalities, and conditions of survivors for military government authorities and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. The scene shocked even men who had liberated other camps. While conditions here were not as catastrophic as Bergen-Belsen or Buchenwald, starvation was evident. Bodies lay in several barracks, dead from typhus, dysentery, and malnutrition. The living occupied beds and floor space with minimal movement. The smell of unwashed bodies, excrement, and death filled the buildings. Medical personnel began triage immediately. The most critical cases received intravenous fluids and careful feeding protocols. Overeating after prolonged starvation could be fatal, a condition called refeeding syndrome that killed numerous concentration camp survivors in the first weeks after liberation. Benton worked alongside medical staff, recording information and attempting to communicate with survivors in multiple languages. Most German civilians spoke German. Foreign workers included Poles, Russians, French, Italians, and others, remnants of Nazi Germany's vast forced labor system. Among the German civilians, Benton encountered Elisabeth Schmitt. She was 31 years old, unmarried, originally from Munich. Her workbook, preserved in her possession, documented her path to Landsberg. Elisabeth had worked in a Munich textile factory until July 1944. When British and American bombers destroyed the factory in a raid targeting industrial infrastructure, she found herself unemployed. In Germany's wartime economy, unemployment was essentially illegal. Citizens were directed to war-essential work. Elisabeth received notification to report for labor service in August 1944. She was assigned to the Landsberg facility with approximately 200 other Munich residents whose factories had been destroyed or who were otherwise surplus to local labor needs. The assignment was presented as temporary war service with payment. The reality proved different. Workers lived in camp barracks, were fed starvation rations, received minimal payment, and could not leave without permission that was rarely granted. While not formally concentration camp prisoners, their conditions differed little from those classified as such. This ambiguous status characterized much of the Nazi forced labor system's operation. Elisabeth worked assembling magnetos for aircraft engines. The work required precision and dexterity. She worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days per week. The factory operated around the clock in multiple shifts. By early 1945, production had become increasingly futile as the Luftwaffe no longer had sufficient fuel, pilots, or aircraft to utilize the components being manufactured. When Benton encountered Elisabeth on April 30th, she weighed approximately 90 pounds. Her pre-war weight, recorded in medical examinations in her workbook, had been 132 pounds. She suffered from severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, lice infestation, and a persistent cough. She could stand and walk, unlike many in the camp. This relative strength came from her having received slightly better rations as a German civilian rather than a foreign deportee or concentration camp prisoner. The Nazi system maintained hierarchies even in starvation. Germans above foreign workers, Western Europeans above Eastern Europeans, Jews and Soviets at the bottom. Over 3 days at Landsberg, Benton returned repeatedly to the barracks where Elisabeth was housed. He brought food from American rations, chocolate bars, canned meat, crackers, coffee. Medical staff had issued warnings about giving too much food too quickly, but small portions were encouraged to supplement medical feeding programs. They communicated in German. Benton's German was imperfect but functional. Elisabeth spoke no English. Their conversations, reconstructed from Benton's later accounts and Elisabeth's diary fragments preserved by their daughter, covered mundane topics initially: where they were from, what they did before the war, whether they had family. Elisabeth's family situation was grim. Her father had died in 1938 from natural causes. Her mother and younger sister had died in the July 1944 bombing raid that destroyed the textile factory. They lived in apartments above the factory. Her older brother served in the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front and had not been heard from since October 1944. She had no one. Benton's fiancée Dorothy had sent him a letter in March 1945, delivered just before the Long March began. She had met someone else. She apologized but said she could not wait indefinitely for a man who might never return. The letter reached Benton during the march, delivered through Red Cross channels in the last organized mail distribution before complete chaos overtook the prisoner columns. On May 2, 1945, the day Germany's southern armies surrendered to American forces, Benton made his promise. According to his account, recorded in a 1967 interview with a local Iowa newspaper, the conversation occurred near the camp's kitchen building where Elisabeth had gone to receive a food distribution. Benton told her that if she survived, if she recovered her health, if she managed the chaos of post-war Germany, he would return and marry her. It was not a proposal in any conventional sense. It was something closer to a vow of intent, conditioned on her survival. He later described it as feeling obligated to offer some hope to someone who had nothing left. Elisabeth's response, according to Benton, was silence, followed by a question. "Why would you do this?" His answer, "Because no one else will, and you deserve to live." This exchange sounds almost too dramatic to be authentic. However, similar promises occurred throughout the liberation of camps and occupied territories. Soldiers confronted with absolute human suffering sometimes made commitments they had no rational reason to make, perhaps seeking to impose some meaning on the meaningless. May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's designated successor after the Führer's suicide on April 30th, signed the final instruments of surrender. The war in Europe ended officially at 11:01 post-meridian Central European Time. For Germany's surviving population of approximately 60 million people, the end of war brought not relief but new uncertainties. The country lay in ruins. Approximately 350,000 German civilians had died in Allied bombing raids. 4 to 5 million German military personnel had died in combat. Major cities were wastelands of rubble: Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, Cologne, Munich. Photographs show landscapes of destruction resembling archaeological sites more than modern cities. Germany's infrastructure had collapsed. Railways, bridges, roads, electrical systems, water supplies, all damaged or destroyed. The economy had ceased functioning. Food supplies were critically short. The 1944 harvest had been poor. The 1945 spring planting was disrupted by combat operations and population dislocations. Starvation threatened millions. The Allied powers divided Germany into occupation zones. The Soviet Union controlled the East. The United States, Britain, and France controlled the West, divided into 3 separate zones. Berlin, deep within the Soviet zone, was further divided into 4 sectors. This division would eventually harden into the Iron Curtain, dividing Europe for 4 decades. Sergeant Benton remained in Germany with occupation forces through late 1945. His unit transitioned from combat operations to military government duties. The 14th Armored Division moved through Bavaria, establishing order, disarming remaining German military units, processing prisoners of war, and managing displaced persons. The displaced persons problem was staggering. An estimated 8 to 11 million people moved through Germany in the months after surrender. These included former forced laborers returning home, concentration camp survivors seeking family or emigration, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, German soldiers returning from captivity, and refugees fleeing Soviet occupation. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration established displaced persons camps. to provide shelter, food, and eventual repatriation or resettlement. These camps housed hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes for years. Conditions varied from adequate to squalid, depending on resources and administration. Elisabeth Schmitt entered the displaced persons system in May 1945. She was transported from Landsberg to a larger facility near Munich. Medical personnel treated her malnutrition with carefully managed feeding programs. She gained weight slowly. Her persistent cough proved to be tuberculosis, requiring isolation and treatment that extended through autumn 1945. Benton attempted to maintain contact with Elisabeth through official and unofficial channels. Military regulations prohibited fraternization with German civilians, a policy intended to prevent exactly the kind of relationship Benton contemplated. The non-fraternization policy, announced in September 1944 and implemented in May 1945, forbade American personnel from mingling with Germans beyond official duties. Violations could result in disciplinary action, including court-martial. In practice, the policy proved unenforceable. Soldiers interacted with German civilians constantly. Romance and relationships developed despite regulations. By autumn 1945, enforcement had relaxed considerably. The policy was formally modified in September 1945 to allow conversation and business interaction, and effectively abandoned by late 1946 when marriages began to be authorized. Benton sent Elisabeth letters through Red Cross channels. She responded when able. These letters, many preserved by the family, reveal a relationship developing through written words in imperfect translation. Benton's German improved. Elisabeth began learning English from phrase books and from British and American personnel at her displaced persons camp. The letters discussed practical matters: her health, his duties, conditions in Germany, the progress of her recovery. They also discussed the promise. Benton repeated his intention to return and marry her if she wished. Elisabeth's responses were more cautious, acknowledging the promise but questioning its wisdom and practicality. In October 1945, Benton received orders for repatriation to the United States. The army was demobilizing rapidly. Approximately 8 million American servicemen were discharged between May 1945 and December 1946. Benton, with his combat service and time as a POW, qualified for early discharge under the point system that prioritized soldiers based on length of service, combat experience, decorations, and time overseas. He sailed from Bremerhaven, Germany to New York in November 1945. From New York, he traveled to Fort Sheridan, Illinois, where he received discharge on November 23, 1945. He returned to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, as a civilian. The readjustment to civilian life proved difficult. Benton's family welcomed him home, but the Iowa he returned to seemed both familiar and strange. The United States had not been physically damaged by war, the economy was booming, consumer goods were becoming available again as factories converted from war production. The contrast with Germany's devastation was jarring. Benton struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, sleep disturbances, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, symptoms common among returning veterans. The Army offered minimal support. Veterans Affairs hospitals existed but were overwhelmed. Most veterans simply tried to resume normal life. Benton took a job at a meatpacking plant in Cedar Rapids. He rented an apartment. He reconnected with friends. His former fiancée Dorothy had married in July 1945. He bore her no ill will. The engagement had been a pre-war artifact, belonging to a different life. Throughout late 1945 and early 1946, he corresponded with Elisabeth. Letters took weeks to travel between Iowa and Germany. The content remained cautious. She reported her continued recovery and tuberculosis treatment. He described Iowa and his work. Neither explicitly addressed the central question of whether he would actually return to marry her. In Elisabeth's letters, preserved in family archives, she repeatedly expressed doubt about the practicality of marriage between them. She cited their limited acquaintance, the language barrier, the impossibility of her emigrating, and the likely opposition of his family. She offered to release him from his promise multiple times. Benton's responses consistently rejected these offers. In a letter dated March 4, 1946, he wrote, "I made a promise. I do not break promises. If you want to marry me, I will arrange it. If you do not, I will accept your decision, but I will not abandon you because it is difficult." This correspondence reveals something important about Benton's character and perhaps about how his POW experience had shaped him. He had survived circumstances where many died. He had been powerless for 2 years. Making and keeping this promise represented a form of agency and meaning in a world that had offered little of either. By spring 1946, Benton had decided to return to Germany. This decision faced significant obstacles. Civilian travel to occupied Germany was restricted. The military controlled access. The occupation was ongoing, with tensions increasing between Western powers and the Soviet Union. However, opportunities existed. The military government needed civilian personnel, administrators, technicians, teachers, medical staff. Reconstruction required skills. Benton applied for civilian employment with the military government in Bavaria. His German language skills, military experience, and knowledge of the region made him a viable candidate. He was hired in June 1946 as a translator and administrative assistant with the military government office in Munich. The position paid reasonably and included housing. Most importantly, it placed him back in Germany near Elisabeth. August 1946. Benton sailed from New York to Bremerhaven as a civilian employee of the United States military government. The ship carried military dependents, government personnel, and a small number of civilians with authorized business in Germany. The crossing took 9 days. Bremerhaven showed war damage extensively. The port had been a major submarine base and had been bombed repeatedly. Reconstruction was underway, but progress was slow. Germany's recovery in 1946 remained minimal. The first post-war year had been one of simple survival. The second year began showing fitful progress in some areas, while other problems worsened. From Bremerhaven, Benton traveled by military train to Munich. The journey took 2 days due to damaged rail infrastructure and multiple security checkpoints. Germany's occupation zones required documentation for all interzone travel. Even within the American zone, movement was controlled to manage the displaced persons population and prevent black market activities. Munich, in August 1946, bore scars of war. The city had been bombed 74 times during the war. Approximately 45% of residential buildings were damaged or destroyed. The population lived in ruins, cellars, and temporary shelters. Food remained strictly rationed. Official rations provided approximately 1,500 calories per day, adequate to prevent starvation, but insufficient for health. The black market flourished. American cigarettes served as currency, more valuable than Reichsmarks. A single carton of cigarettes could buy luxury goods or substantial quantities of food, coffee, chocolate, alcohol. American goods commanded high prices. Corruption was endemic. Military personnel and occupation staff engaged in black market activities despite regulations and courts-martial. Benton reported to the military government office on August 12, 1946. His duties involved translating documents, interpreting at meetings between American officials and German administrators, and processing requests from German civilians for various permits and permissions. The work was bureaucratic but necessary for the functioning of occupation government. His immediate priority was locating Elisabeth. She remained in the displaced persons camp near Munich, where she had been since May 1945. The camp had transitioned from emergency facility to semi-permanent settlement. Many residents had nowhere to go. Germany's housing shortage made independent living impossible for people without resources. Elisabeth fell into this category, recovered from tuberculosis as of January 1946, but without family, property, or means. Benton visited the camp on August 15, 1946. They had not seen each other in person since May 1945, 16 months earlier. Their relationship existed primarily through letters. Now they faced each other again as potential marriage partners, rather than soldier and survivor. According to both their later accounts, the reunion was awkward. Elisabeth had recovered physically, her weight had returned to near pre-war levels, but she remained cautious and uncertain. Benton appeared different to her as well, civilian clothes, healthier, more confident than the gaunt sergeant she remembered from Landsberg. They spoke in German, walking around the campgrounds. Benton asked if she still wished to marry him. Elisabeth asked if he truly understood what he was proposing. Marriage to a German woman would face enormous obstacles in America and would not be easy even in Germany. Benton's response, according to Elisabeth's account in a 1972 interview with a graduate student researching war brides, was, "I kept myself alive in the camps by making promises to myself about what I would do if I survived. I kept those promises. This is one more promise I intend to keep." Elisabeth agreed to marry him. She later said she agreed partly because she saw no other viable future, and partly because she believed he would not have returned to Germany if he were not sincere. The decision made, they faced practical obstacles. Marriage between American occupation personnel and German civilians required official approval from military authorities. The process had been established in June 1946, when regulations were modified to allow such marriages. The requirements included written application to commanding officer, background investigation of the German fiancé, proof that the German fiancé was not a Nazi Party member, medical examination of both parties, waiting period of typically 3 to 6 months, command approval at multiple levels. The background investigation was thorough. Military intelligence personnel examined Elisabeth's workbook, interviewed witnesses from Munich, checked Nazi Party membership records, and reviewed her entire history from birth records forward. This investigation uncovered no disqualifying information. Elisabeth had never been a Nazi Party member. Party membership was not mandatory for factory workers. Though it could provide advantages, she had no criminal record, no evidence suggested collaboration with Nazi persecution beyond the passive cooperation required of all German citizens under dictatorship. The investigation report, filed in September 1946, concluded that Elisabeth Schmitt presented no security risk and that her forced labor status actually indicated she had been a victim rather than a supporter of the regime. Medical examinations confirmed both parties were healthy. Elisabeth's tuberculosis had been arrested through treatment. Benton showed no communicable diseases. Both were certified as fit for marriage. The command approval process took 4 months. Benton's application moved through various administrative levels. Some officers opposed such marriages on principle. Others supported them as part of rebuilding German society and demonstrating democratic values. The policy remained controversial within the military. Final approval came in January 1947. Benton and Elisabeth could marry. However, marriage did not automatically grant Elisabeth permission to emigrate to the United States. That required separate immigration procedures under the War Brides Act. January 25, 1947. Munich, Germany. John Benton and Elisabeth Schmitt married in a civil ceremony at the Munich Registrar's office. German law required civil ceremonies for legal recognition. Religious ceremonies were optional and separate. The ceremony was brief and formal. A German registrar conducted the proceedings in German. An American military official witnessed for documentation purposes. Benton wore a civilian suit. Elisabeth wore a simple dress borrowed from another woman at the displaced persons camp. No family attended. Benton's family was in Iowa, and Elisabeth had no surviving family. 2 witnesses, both American government employees Benton worked with, completed the legal requirements. The marriage certificate, filed with both German civil authorities and American military government, recorded the union. This document would prove crucial for immigration proceedings. Under the War Brides Act of December 1945, foreign-born spouses of American servicemen could immigrate to the United States outside normal immigration quotas. The act initially applied only to servicemen, but was expanded to include civilian employees of the military government in July 1946. Benton's status as a military government employee qualified Elisabeth for this pathway. The immigration process required extensive documentation: marriage certificate, birth certificates for both parties, medical examinations, background checks, financial affidavits, proving ability to support spouse travel arrangements, visa processing through State Department. The process typically took 6 to 12 months. Elisabeth began the application in February 1947. Background checks were repeated, duplicating the pre-marriage investigations. Medical examinations were more thorough for immigration purposes, checking for conditions that might make her inadmissible under American immigration law. While waiting for approval, Elisabeth and Benton lived in Munich. Military government employees received housing allocations. Benton qualified for married housing, a small apartment in a requisition building in a less damaged section of the city. The apartment had electricity, running water, and heat, luxuries many Germans lacked in the harsh winter of 1946 to 1947. That winter was one of the coldest on record in Europe. Temperatures remained below freezing for weeks. Coal supplies were critically short. Food supplies worsened as harsh weather disrupted distribution. This period became known as the Hunger Winter or Starvation Winter in Germany. Death rates increased significantly, particularly among elderly and already weakened populations. The American occupation zone fared better than other zones due to American logistical capabilities and willingness to use resources to prevent complete collapse. Even so, conditions were harsh. Official rations decreased to 1,200 calories per day in January 1947. Supplemental programs, black market purchases, and direct American aid prevented mass starvation but could not prevent suffering. Elisabeth and Benton shared their apartment with another American couple, a common practice given housing shortages. The arrangement was sometimes awkward but necessary. Elisabeth's English improved rapidly through immersion. Benton's German became fluent. They developed routines approximating normal married life despite abnormal circumstances. News of their marriage reached Cedar Rapids through Benton's letters home to his family. The response was not enthusiastic. Benton's mother expressed concern about marrying a German so soon after the war. His father was more direct, writing in March 1947 that bringing a German woman to Iowa would face significant hostility. These concerns reflected broader American attitudes. Public opinion polls from 1947 showed that approximately 60% of Americans opposed American servicemen marrying German or Japanese women. The wounds of war remained fresh. Americans had been told for 4 years that Germans were enemies, and shifting that perception required time. Elisabeth's immigration approval came through in August 1947. Her visa was issued, transportation was arranged, and departure was scheduled for September. The process had taken 7 months, relatively quick given the bureaucratic complexities involved. Benton faced a decision about his own plans. His contract with the military government extended through October 1947. He could accompany Elisabeth to the United States or complete his contract and join her later. He chose to accompany her, resigning from his position a month early, September 15, 1947. Bremerhaven, Germany. Elisabeth joined approximately 200 other German war brides boarding a transport ship for the United States. These sailings occurred regularly. By the end of 1947, approximately 15,000 German women had emigrated as war brides. The ship was the USAT General W.G. Hahn, a troop transport converted for dependent and civilian use. The crossing took 10 days. Most women were young, in their 20s and early 30s. Most spoke limited English, many were pregnant. Marriage and immigration often proceeded rapidly once approved. The Atlantic crossing was rough. September storms made many passengers seasick. The ship's accommodations were basic: dormitory-style sleeping areas, shared mess halls, limited privacy. Women formed social groups, sharing anxieties about their destinations and futures. Benton traveled with Elisabeth, one of the few husbands accompanying their wives. Most servicemen had returned to the United States earlier, with wives following once paperwork cleared. His presence provided Elisabeth some comfort in an otherwise overwhelming situation. September 25, 1947, the ship docked in New York Harbor. Ellis Island processing had been closed for immigration in November 1946, with functions transferred to other facilities. War brides were processed shipboard or at dockside facilities, expediting entry. Elisabeth Schmitt Benton entered the United States as a legal immigrant, sponsored by her American husband under the War Brides Act. She was one of approximately 15,000 German war brides who would enter between 1945 and 1950, part of a larger wave of approximately 100,000 war brides from all countries. From New York, the Bentons traveled by train to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The journey took 2 days. Elisabeth's first impressions of America, recorded years later in interviews, emphasized the abundance: food, consumer goods, undamaged cities, normalcy. The contrast with Germany was profound. September 27, 1947, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. John and Elisabeth Benton arrived at the Cedar Rapids train station. John's parents, Herman and Margaret Benton, met them on the platform. The reunion was formal and strained. Herman Benton shook his son's hand, embraced him briefly. He nodded to Elisabeth, but did not embrace her. Margaret Benton offered a thin smile and a handshake. The family drove to the Benton home in silence, broken by occasional polite questions about the journey. Cedar Rapids was a city of approximately 60,000 people, a meatpacking and industrial center in eastern Iowa. The war had brought prosperity, full employment, expanded facilities, increased population. Unlike European cities, Cedar Rapids showed no war damage. Streets were intact, buildings whole, shops stocked with goods. For Elisabeth, the contrast was overwhelming. Germany in September 1947 remained a landscape of ruins, shortages, and desperation. America appeared untouched, abundant, impossibly normal. The psychological adjustment this required cannot be overstated. The Benton family home was a modest 2-story frame house in a working-class neighborhood. John's parents had lived there since 1928. His childhood bedroom remained largely unchanged. The house had indoor plumbing, electric lighting, central heating, a refrigerator, a radio, ordinary American amenities that represented luxury to someone from post-war Germany. Elisabeth and John stayed with his parents initially while John sought employment, and they searched for their own apartment. This arrangement lasted 6 weeks and was uncomfortable for all parties. Herman Benton was not overtly hostile but remained distant and disapproving. Margaret Benton made efforts at civility but struggled with having a German daughter-in-law. The town's reaction reflected broader American attitudes. Cedar Rapids had sent approximately 1,500 men to war. 83 had died. Gold Star flags still hung in windows of families who had lost sons. Newspapers had reported concentration camp liberations, Bataan Death March, and other atrocities. Germans were firmly fixed in public consciousness as enemies. John found work at the Wilson meatpacking plant where his father also worked. The job was floor-level labor, livestock handling, basic butchering, cold storage work. It paid adequately but was physically demanding and unpleasant. John had hoped his military government experience might lead to administrative work, but such positions required education and connections he lacked. Elisabeth sought work as well, needing both income and activity. Her limited English restricted options, she found employment at a commercial laundry, pressing and folding sheets and linens. The work was repetitive and hot, but required minimal language skills. The couple rented a small apartment in November 1947, ending their stay with John's parents. The apartment had 1 bedroom, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Rent was $40. monthly, approximately 1/4 of their combined income. The space was modest, but their own. Social integration proved challenging. John's pre-war friends had mostly married and started families. Some welcomed John but were uncomfortable around Elisabeth, others avoided contact. The German identity was an obstacle that required time to overcome. Elisabeth experienced direct hostility on several occasions. A woman in a grocery store recognized her German accent and loudly denounced her as a Nazi. The store manager asked both women to leave, treating them as equally responsible for the disturbance. Elisabeth stopped speaking German in public, attempting to minimize her accent when speaking English. The local German-American community, descendants of 19th-century immigrants, had kept low profiles during the war. Speaking German publicly had been unwise. German cultural organizations had suspended activities. By 1947, this community was slowly reactivating. Elisabeth made contact with several German-speaking families, finding some social acceptance there. The Catholic Church provided another point of connection. Elisabeth had been raised Catholic, and John had converted before their marriage in Germany. The local Catholic parish had a long history of serving German immigrants. The priest, Father Muller, was himself German-American and made efforts to integrate Elisabeth into the parish community. By early 1948, life had established routines. John and Elisabeth both worked. They attended church on Sundays. They saved money toward better goals, a house eventually, perhaps a car, security. The marriage functioned, though it existed somewhat in isolation from broader community. Letters from Germany arrived regularly. The situation there remained difficult. Food supplies had improved slightly but were still inadequate. Political tensions increased as the Cold War emerged. Berlin became a flashpoint, leading to the Soviet blockade and Allied airlift in June 1948. Elisabeth followed German news closely through German-language newspapers available at the public library. She felt guilt about having escaped, while Germans in the Soviet zone faced particularly harsh conditions. This survivor guilt was common among emigrants and refugees. In August 1948, Elisabeth discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy was unplanned but welcome. Both she and John had wanted children eventually. The news prompted John's parents to warm somewhat. The prospect of a grandchild reduced their emotional distance. The pregnancy proceeded normally. Elisabeth continued working at the laundry through February 1949, then stopped due to physical demands of the work. John took additional shifts at the meatpacking plant to compensate for lost income. May 14, 1949. Elisabeth gave birth to a daughter, Karen Margaret Benton, at Mercy Hospital in Cedar Rapids. The birth was uncomplicated. Mother and child were healthy. The birth transformed family dynamics. Hermann and Margaret Benton visited the hospital and held their granddaughter. Whatever reservations they maintained about Elisabeth became secondary to their role as grandparents. This shift was gradual but significant. The broader community also responded more positively. A baby humanized Elisabeth in ways that had not occurred previously. Neighbors who had been distant became friendly. Women at church offered advice and assistance. The German identity receded in importance relative to her role as a mother. John and Elisabeth settled into parenthood. The apartment became more cramped with a baby, but moving would require saving more money. They managed. John continued at the meatpacking plant. Elisabeth cared for Karen and took in sewing work for additional income. By late 1949, the Bentons had achieved a modest but stable life. They were not wealthy or prominent. They remained somewhat outside full community integration due to Elisabeth's origin. But they had survived the transition from war to peace, from enemies to family. August 1950. A local Cedar Rapids reporter, James Sullivan, heard about John and Elisabeth Benton's story through casual conversation. Sullivan worked for the Cedar Rapids Gazette, a daily newspaper serving eastern Iowa. He specialized in human interest stories, profiles of interesting local residents and unusual situations. The story of an American ex-POW marrying a German woman he met at a liberated labor camp struck Sullivan as potentially compelling. He approached the Bentons about writing an article. John and Elisabeth were initially reluctant. They had worked to establish normal lives and were not seeking attention. Sullivan persisted, arguing that their story demonstrated American values: compassion, promise-keeping, reconciliation. Eventually, the Bentons agreed to an interview conducted in their apartment in late August 1950. The article appeared on September 10, 1950, in the Sunday Gazette under the headline, "Ex-POW Keeps Wartime Promise. Cedar Rapids Man Returns to Germany to Marry Woman He Vowed to Help." The piece was approximately 1,500 words, including a photograph of John, Elisabeth, and one-year-old Karen. The article recounted John's capture, imprisonment, liberation, his encounter with Elisabeth at Landsberg, the promise he made, his return to Germany, and their marriage and immigration to Iowa. Sullivan wrote in a style emphasizing John's heroism and Elisabeth's gratitude, framing the story as redemptive and romantic. The article's publication generated significant response. The Gazette received letters to the editor, approximately 24 published over the following 2 weeks. The responses were mixed. Some praised John's character and compassion. Others questioned whether helping a German woman was appropriate given German atrocities. Several letters debated whether Germans deserved sympathy. This local article might have remained merely local, except that it was picked up by the Associated Press wire service. AP editors saw potential for broader interest. The story was distributed nationally in shortened form, approximately 400 words, in mid-September 1950. Newspapers across the United States published the AP version. The story appeared in the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, and dozens of smaller papers. Each publication adapted the headline and sometimes modified content slightly, but the core narrative remained consistent. The national publicity brought interview requests. Radio programs wanted John and Elisabeth as guests. Life magazine sent a photographer to Cedar Rapids, producing a photo essay that appeared in the October 23, 1950 issue. The essay included images of the Benton family at home, at church, and at John's workplace. This attention was overwhelming. The Bentons had not anticipated national media interest. They granted some interviews, declined others. John took a week off work to manage the situation. Elisabeth, uncomfortable with attention and still self-conscious about her accent, generally avoided speaking to reporters when possible. The publicity reached Germany. German newspapers, particularly in the American occupation zone, reported the story as evidence of American-German friendship and post-war reconciliation. The story fit narratives both governments were promoting as Cold War tensions escalated, and West Germany became a crucial American ally. Some German coverage located and interviewed Elisabeth's surviving relatives, cousins she had lost contact with. This led to Elisabeth re-establishing correspondence with extended family members, providing her with renewed connection to her homeland. The story also reached former POWs. Veterans organizations published it in newsletters. Men who had been at Stalag 2B or who had experienced the Long March contacted John. Some wanted to share their experiences, others simply wanted to acknowledge their shared history. Not all responses were positive. Some veterans felt John had betrayed other POWs by marrying a German. Anonymous letters arrived expressing this sentiment, sometimes viciously. One letter accused him of dishonoring men who died in captivity. Another suggested Elisabeth must have been a guard or collaborator. Despite the documented facts, the Bentons weathered this attention. It subsided by late November 1950 as other stories captured public interest. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, dominated news coverage by autumn. The Benton story became a brief curiosity rather than sustained focus. However, the publicity had lasting effects. In Cedar Rapids, the Bentons were now publicly known. Elisabeth's German identity was established fact rather than something kept quiet. This forced a kind of acceptance. People who might have avoided Germans generally made exceptions for someone featured positively in Life magazine. The story also created a public interpretation of their relationship that didn't entirely match private reality. Media coverage emphasized romance and heroism. The actual experience had been more complicated: desperation, moral obligation, practical necessity, mixed with genuine affection. The public version was simpler and more palatable. Elisabeth gave one interview in German to a German newspaper, published in December 1950. In it, she spoke more candidly than in American interviews. She acknowledged the difficulty of her position, grateful for survival and opportunity, but forever marked as a German in America and as an American immigrant when communicating with Germany. She described herself as belonging fully to neither country now. This interview was translated and appeared in several German publications, but was not widely reported in American media. It represented a more nuanced perspective than the straightforward narrative preferred by American journalists. The publicity surrounding the Bentons' marriage occurred against the backdrop of rapidly changing American-German relations. The Cold War had transformed Germany from enemy to crucial ally in just 5 years. The Berlin blockade of June 1948 through May 1949 demonstrated American commitment to defending West Germany against Soviet pressure. The Berlin airlift, Operation Vittles, saw American and British aircraft deliver over 2 million tons of supplies to blockaded Berlin, preventing Soviet consolidation of control. The Federal Republic of Germany was established in May 1949, creating a West German state aligned with Western democracies. Konrad Adenauer became the first chancellor. The new constitution emphasized democratic governance and human rights as explicit rejections of Nazi ideology. American policy toward Germany shifted from punishment and denazification to reconstruction and alliance building. The Marshall Plan provided massive economic aid, approximately $1.4 billion to West Germany between 1948 and 1952. This aid facilitated the economic miracle that transformed West Germany from ruins to prosperity within a decade. This policy transformation required reshaping American public opinion about Germans. Stories like the Bentons served this purpose, intentionally or not. They demonstrated that Germans could be victims rather than only perpetrators, that individual Germans were redeemable, and that American-German friendship was possible and valuable. The media attention given to the Benton story in 1950 was part of broader cultural work to rehabilitate Germany's image. Hollywood films began portraying sympathetic German characters. News coverage emphasized West German democratic development. Educational materials stressed German cultural contributions to Western civilization. This rehabilitation had limits and critics. Jewish American organizations objected to what they perceived as premature forgiveness. Veterans groups remained hostile to Germany. Public opinion polls through the early 1950s showed Americans remained ambivalent about Germans, even as official policy embraced partnership. The Bentons occupied an interesting position in this cultural moment. Their story could be interpreted as validating American magnanimity and German redemption. It demonstrated that former enemies could become family, literalizing the metaphor of Western alliance. However, the Bentons themselves did not frame their marriage in political terms. In interviews, John emphasized personal promise-keeping rather than broader reconciliation. Elisabeth spoke about survival and gratitude rather than German-American relations. Their story was personal, even as it was used for political purposes. The 1950s brought progressive normalization for the Benton family. The media attention faded. John continued working at the meatpacking plant, eventually receiving promotions to supervisor positions based on experience and reliability. Elisabeth cared for Karen and later a second child, Robert John Benton, born in March 1953. The family moved to a larger apartment in 1952, then purchased a small house in 1955. This house, a two-bedroom bungalow in a working-class neighborhood, represented hard-earned stability. The mortgage payments stretched their budget, but home ownership provided security and status. Elisabeth applied for American citizenship in 1952, becoming eligible after 5 years of residence. The naturalization process required literacy in English, knowledge of American history and government, and swearing an oath of allegiance. She passed the citizenship examination in August 1952 and was naturalized on September 15, 1952, exactly 5 years after arriving in America. The citizenship meant Elisabeth could vote, hold certain jobs, and sponsor relatives for immigration. More symbolically, it represented formal membership in American society. She was no longer a German national living in America, but an American of German origin. Her German accent never fully disappeared, marking her as foreign-born even decades later. But by the mid-1950s, German immigrants were not notably unusual in Iowa, which had significant German-American populations from 19th-century immigration waves. Elisabeth's difference was timing rather than ethnicity. The Benton children grew up in typical 1950s American suburban culture. Karen attended public school, participated in Girl Scouts, took piano lessons. Robert played Little League baseball. The family attended Catholic church regularly. They were unremarkable except for Elisabeth's accent, and the story occasionally mentioned, but not emphasized, Elisabeth maintained German language and some traditions at home. She cooked German dishes, celebrated German holidays privately, spoke German with the children so they would learn the language. This cultural maintenance was encouraged in post-war America as celebrating ethnic heritage rather than threatening foreign loyalty. She corresponded with relatives in Germany throughout her life. Occasionally, she sent care packages when relatives faced difficulties. She followed German news and politics. She never returned to Germany for a visit. The expense was prohibitive, and emotional barriers were significant. John progressed steadily at the meatpacking plant. By 1958, he was a shift supervisor, managing crews and coordinating production. The work was still industrial labor but had become less physically demanding. His income supported the family modestly but adequately. The marriage endured. John and Elisabeth were not effusively affectionate publicly, but they functioned effectively as partners. They raised children, managed finances, maintained a household. Their relationship was characterized by mutual respect and pragmatic cooperation more than romantic passion. In 1960, both John and Elisabeth were interviewed again, this time by a graduate student from the University of Iowa researching war brides. The interviews, recorded and transcribed, are preserved in the university archives. They provide the most detailed first-person accounts of their experiences. John, in his interview, reflected on his promise, I'm not sure I can explain why I made it. I was 26 years old, had been a prisoner for 2 years, had seen things no one should see. She was dying. I could help, so I promised I would. Then I had to keep the promise, because what else are you if you don't keep your word? Elisabeth spoke about her survival. The promise gave me something to live for when I had nothing. I do not know if I would have survived otherwise. People were dying every day in that camp. Why not me? But I had his promise, so I survived to see if he would keep it. Both acknowledged the marriage had not been without difficulties. Cultural differences, language barriers, family tensions, economic stress. These were ongoing challenges, but both expressed satisfaction with their life together and no regret about the choices made. The 1960s and 70s saw the Benton family continue in patterns established in the 50s. The children graduated high school, Karen in 1967, Robert in 1971. Both attended community college. Karen became a teacher. Robert worked in construction. John retired from the meatpacking plant in 1975 at age 56. Eligible for early retirement through the union pension plan. The meatpacking industry was declining in Cedar Rapids as plants consolidated and moved elsewhere. The Wilson plant, where John had worked for 28 years, closed in 1976. His retirement 1 year earlier was fortunate timing. Elisabeth never worked full-time after the children were born, but she took part-time jobs occasionally: retail clerk, cafeteria worker, seamstress. These jobs supplemented income and provided social connection more than career development. The Benton story was revisited occasionally by journalists on anniversary dates or when broader stories about war brides were published. A 30-year anniversary article appeared in the Cedar Rapids Gazette in 1977. A television news feature aired in 1985 on the 40th anniversary of VE Day. These later pieces had different tones than the original 1950 coverage. 1970s and 80s journalism was less romantic and more analytical. Articles discussed the practical difficulties of intercultural marriage, the psychological impact of war trauma, the complexity of forgiveness and reconciliation. The Bentons were no longer simply a heartwarming story, but a case study in historical memory and social change. Elisabeth granted a final extensive interview to an oral historian in 1982. The interview, conducted over 3 sessions and totaling approximately 6 hours of recorded audio, is preserved at the State Historical Society of Iowa. In it, Elisabeth reflected on her entire life: childhood in Munich, the war, forced labor, liberation, immigration, and her decades in America. She spoke about carrying guilt. I was German. My country did terrible things. I did not do those things myself, but I was part of that country. How do you reconcile that? You cannot. You carry it always. She spoke about belonging. I am American now, yes, for 40 years, but I am also always German. Not the Germany that did those things, but Germany that existed before and Germany that came after. I carry both countries inside me. She spoke about the promise. John gave me a reason to survive when I had none. For that, I am grateful every day, even now. The marriage was not always easy, but it was real. It was honest. It was enough. John Benton died in November 1988 at age 69 from heart failure. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette was brief, several paragraphs noting his military service, his work career, his survivors. One sentence mentioned his marriage to Elisabeth. In 1947, he married Elisabeth Schmitt, a German woman he met during the liberation of labor camps in Germany. Elisabeth lived another 12 years after John's death. She remained in the house they had purchased in 1955, supported partly by Social Security and John's pension, partly by help from her children. She maintained correspondence with relatives in Germany, followed news, attended church. She gave her final interview in 1998 at age 83 to a documentary filmmaker producing a PBS program about war brides. By then, her English had an interesting quality, grammatically correct but with persistent German accent and occasional German sentence structures. She spoke about John. He kept his promise. That is what matters. He said he would come back and marry me if I survived. I survived. He came back. We married. That is all of it. Elisabeth Schmitt Benton died in May 2000 at age 85. Her obituary noted her birth in Munich, her immigration to America, her naturalized citizenship, her marriage, her children, and grandchildren. One paragraph mentioned the circumstances of her meeting John, describing it as a remarkable wartime story of survival and promise-keeping. The Benton family story, preserved through documents and interviews, provides insight into several historical phenomena: POW experiences, forced labor in Nazi Germany, liberation of camps, American military government in occupied Germany, war brides and immigration, post-war reconciliation, and intercultural marriage. Primary sources documenting the story include John Benton's military service records, National Archives, POW correspondence from Stalag 2B, Red Cross Archives, Elisabeth's workbook from Forced Labor, Family Archives, later donated, marriage certificate from Munich, 1947, Benton Family Papers, immigration documentation under War Brides Act, INS records, newspaper articles from 1950 onward, various archives, oral history interviews from 1960, 1982, and 1998, University of Iowa and State Historical Society. Personal correspondence between John and Elisabeth, 1945 through 1988, Family Archives. Photographs documenting their lives from liberation through late life, Family Archives. These materials, donated to the State Historical Society of Iowa by the Benton children in 2002, comprise a significant collection for researchers studying post-POW social history. The story fits within larger patterns while retaining individual specificity. Approximately 15,000 German women married American servicemen between 1945 and 1955. The Bentons' marriage was one among many, yet each marriage represented unique circumstances and individual choices. The promise John made at Landsberg was unusual in being articulated explicitly and then fulfilled intentionally. Many wartime relationships formed chaotically without clear commitments. The deliberateness of John's promise and his systematic efforts to keep it distinguished this case. The relationship between former POW and forced laborer also distinguished it from most war bride marriages, which typically involved occupation soldiers and German civilian women meeting after liberation. The connection forged during liberation itself, at a moment of extreme crisis, created different dynamics. Scholarly analysis of the Benton case appears in several academic works on war brides and post-war German-American relations. A 2004 dissertation from Georgetown University examining war bride experiences included a chapter analyzing the Benton marriage as a case study. A 2009 article in the Journal of American History discussing memory and reconciliation cited the Benton story as an example of personal narrative serving broader cultural functions. The story has also been used pedagogically. High school and college courses on World War II, post-war America, or immigration history use the Benton materials as primary sources. Students analyze how individual experiences reflect broader historical forces and how personal memories become historical narratives. The Benton story raises questions about promise-keeping, moral obligation, survival, and reconciliation that extend beyond the specific individuals involved. John's promise was made under extraordinary circumstances that might seem to absolve him of obligation. Military captivity, physical trauma, psychological stress, the chaos of liberation, any of these could excuse not following through. Yet he chose to keep the promise despite significant obstacles and social costs. His motivation appears to have been partly character, a personality disposed to keeping commitments, and partly meaning-making. The war had been meaningless suffering for many who experienced it. Creating meaning through deliberate moral action provided psychological structure. Elisabeth's perspective was more complex. She survived partly because the promise gave her will to live, but she also recognized the burden this placed on John. Her repeated offers to release him from the obligation showed awareness of the social and practical difficulties their marriage would face. The marriage itself succeeded by conventional measures. It lasted until John's death, produced children, achieved modest economic stability, and provided both parties with companionship and support. Whether it provided happiness is harder to assess. Both parties expressed satisfaction in interviews, but also acknowledged difficulties and compromises. The public interpretation of their story emphasized romance and heroism, fitting narratives Americans wanted to believe about war's aftermath. The private reality was more pragmatic, two people who helped each other survive extreme circumstances and then built a functional life together. The story's reception changed over time, reflecting shifting cultural attitudes toward Germany, war, and gender relations. 1950 coverage emphasized American magnanimity. 1970 coverage questioned whether forgiveness came too easily. 2000 coverage focused on individual agency and complicated moral landscapes. For the German-American community, the story provided a form of redemption narrative. Elisabeth represented Germany redeemed through American values: democracy, freedom, opportunity. Her successful integration suggested German immigrants could be loyal Americans despite recent enmity. For the POW community, responses varied. Some veterans saw John as exemplifying values of compassion and humanity that must survive war's brutality. Others saw betrayal of fellow prisoners who died in German captivity. These conflicting interpretations never fully resolved. For Cedar Rapids and Iowa, the story became local history, a reminder that national and international events touched individual lives in unexpected ways. The bronze plaque in Veterans Memorial Park, placed 17 years after John's death and 5 years after Elisabeth's, represented community acknowledgement of this history. The story of John Benton and Elisabeth Schmitt is documented history. It happened. The records exist. The people were real. The promise was made and kept. April 30th, 1945 began with German defeat and ended with liberation. Among thousands of people released from captivity that day, two individuals made connection that would survive the peace that followed war. Sergeant John Benton, who had been a prisoner for 26 months, encountered Elisabeth Schmitt, who had been forced laborer for 9 months. He made a promise. She survived. He returned. They married. The promise cost John social acceptance and complicated his relationship with family and community. It brought Elisabeth to a foreign country where she would always be marked as other. The marriage provided both with partnership but also required constant navigation of cultural and linguistic differences. They raised children who grew up American while carrying German heritage. They built modest economic stability through consistent work. They lived unremarkably except for the story that preceded their ordinary life. John Benton died having kept his promise. Elisabeth Schmitt, Benton died having survived and built a life from survival. Their children and grandchildren carry forward their story and their choices. The documents preserved in archives mean researchers decades or centuries hence will be able to reconstruct these lives. The letters, the photographs, the recorded interviews, the official documents, these materials transform lived experience into historical evidence. The Benton story demonstrates that individual moral choices matter even in circumstances that seem to render individual action meaningless. War creates conditions of absolute power and absolute powerlessness. Yet even in those circumstances, people exercise moral agency. The promise made at Landsberg was not required by military discipline, international law, or social expectation. It was freely chosen. Its fulfillment was freely chosen. These free choices had consequences: a marriage, children, a life built across national and cultural boundaries. Whether this constitutes reconciliation between peoples or merely between two individuals is debatable. The Cold War alliance between America and West Germany proceeded from strategic calculation more than moral sentiment. Individual marriages like the Bentons did not determine policy. Yet thousands of such marriages occurred, creating family connections across the divide of recent war. These connections humanized former enemies and created personal stakes in maintaining peace. They represented reconciliation at the most fundamental level, the willingness to build family with former enemy. The Benton story is remarkable primarily because it was documented and publicized. Thousands of similar stories occurred without media attention or preservation. Those stories are lost unless participants recorded them privately. John and Elisabeth Benton agreed to tell their story multiple times over 50 years. This willingness to be examined, to have their choices questioned and analyzed, contributed to historical understanding. They made their private experience public record. The story's meaning lies not in exceptional heroism, but in ordinary follow-through. John made a promise. He kept it. That is not complicated. Its simplicity makes it powerful. Elisabeth survived conditions designed to destroy her. She accepted help when offered. She rebuilt life in foreign circumstances. She adapted to language, culture, and society fundamentally different from her origin. That is not exceptional. Millions of immigrants have done likewise. Its commonality makes it significant. Their daughter Karen said in a 2008 interview, "My parents weren't heroes. They were just people who did what they said they would do. That's the whole story. Dad promised, Mom survived. They both did what was required. That's enough." Perhaps it is. The photograph from Landsberg shows rows of people at liberation. Individual faces are difficult to distinguish. The image documents mass suffering and mass rescue. Each face in that photograph was a person with history, with family, with hopes that had been nearly destroyed. One face may have been Elisabeth Schmitt, probably was, given the date and location, but certain identification is impossible. She was one among many. Her story was particular to her, but also representative of millions who suffered in that war. John Benton's dog tags, preserved by the family and donated to the archives, bear stamped metal letters: Benton John E. serial number, blood type, religion. These tags identified him as individual and as category. One American soldier among millions. His particularity mattered. His category mattered. Both are true simultaneously. The promise connected one particular person to another particular person. It also connected nations, histories, and futures. Both are true simultaneously. John Edward Benton was born May 3, 1919, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He died November 18, 1988, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He lived 69 years. He served his country, he kept his promises, he is remembered. Elisabeth Schmitt was born August 7, 1914, in Munich, Germany. She died May 22, 2000, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She lived 85 years. She survived war, she built new life, she is remembered. Their story is documented, it is preserved, it is available to anyone who seeks to understand how individuals lived through history and how their choices shaped the peace that followed war. That is enough. That is everything.